Welcome. In every single business, in any industry you can think of, there's this fundamental tension. It's the gap between what our processes are actually doing and what our customers need them to do. And it's in this gap between reality and our requirements that quality is either won or lost. This session is designed to be a deep dive, a masterclass, to give you a complete and really confident understanding of process capability. These are the tools that let us measure, understand, and ultimately master that tension. We're going to learn the language of variation and build step by step until we reach a point of true clarity. Our journey today is structured pretty carefully to build your understanding from the ground up, kind of like constructing a solid building. We'll start with the most basic question: what even is capability? Then we'll introduce two essential perspectives we have to hold in our minds: the voice of the process, what our system is really telling us, and the voice of the customer, what the world is asking of us. Only then, with that foundation in place, can we start to build on it with our key metrics. We'll learn to tell the difference between a process's potential versus what it's actually doing, and then look at its performance over the long haul. And finally, we're going to secure the whole structure by understanding the one thing that's non-negotiable, the prerequisite that makes all this analysis meaningful in the first place: process stability. So let's start with that core question. For way too long, a lot of businesses have just run on intuition. We feel like a process is running well. We think we're meeting customer needs. But process capability analysis forces us to ask a much more rigorous, a more honest question. Is it truly good enough? It's really a method for moving past anecdotes and opinions and into the world of actual statistical proof. It's all about replacing "I think so" with "I can prove it." Let's think about this in real terms. Whether you're talking about the weight of a cookie, the precise diameter of a screw, or even the time it takes to process an insurance claim, every single thing we produce has a target and it has an acceptable range. The fundamental challenge here is that no process is perfect. You can't produce the exact same result down to the last micron or millisecond every single time. It's just not possible. There will always be some level of natural, inherent variation. So the critical question isn't, is there variation? Of course there is. The real question is the amount of variation in our process small enough to consistently stay inside the boundaries of what our customer expects? This is the exact question that process capability was invented to answer. To answer that question, we need to get comfortable with a really central idea: the two voices. First up, we have the voice of the process. This is the unvarnished truth. It's what our process is actually delivering, day in and day out, with all its natural ups and downs. We describe this voice using data, its average performance, and, most importantly, its natural spread, its variation. And on the other side, we have the voice of the customer. This isn't about what our process is doing, it's about what we need it to do. It's that set of non-negotiable requirements, the specification limits we're given. Process capability, at its core, is really just the art and science of comparing these two voices, of overlaying the reality of our process onto the demands of our customer to see how they match up. Now, it's really tempting to start with what the customer wants, but that's actually a mistake. We have to begin by understanding our own process first. Before we can judge our performance against any external standard, we have to listen really carefully to what the data is telling us. We've got to understand the natural behavior, the inherent rhythm and consistency, or maybe the inconsistency of what we are doing. This is our first foundational block. The very first thing we just have to accept is what the great quality pioneer W. Edwards Deming called a law of nature: the universal existence of variation. No matter how controlled we think a process is, no two outputs will ever be perfectly, absolutely identical. There will always be tiny, unavoidable fluctuations caused by a million little factors. So our mission isn't the impossible task of eliminating all variation. No, our mission is to understand its nature and its size, to measure it, and then ultimately to bring it into a state of predictable statistical control, where that variation is consistent and stable over time. Okay, so if we need to measure this cloud of variation, what language do we use? Well, that language is the standard deviation, often shown by the Greek letter sigma. Now, don't let the name throw you. Conceptually, standard deviation is just a measure of the average distance of each data point from the process average. Imagine you're throwing darts at a dartboard. The average of all of your throws might be right on the bullseye, but the standard deviation tells you, on average, how far away from that bullseye each of your individual darts landed. A small standard deviation, a small sigma, means all your darts are tightly clustered together. That's a consistent, predictable process. A large sigma tells us our darts are scattered all over the board. Our process is wide, it's inconsistent, and it creates a huge range of outcomes. Sigma is the single most important number for quantifying the voice of the process. And here is where sigma becomes incredibly powerful. When a process is stable, its output often follows this predictable pattern that we call the normal distribution. That classic bell-shaped curve you see here. The very peak of the curve is our process average, and with sigma, we can make remarkably accurate predictions about this process without having to measure every single item. We know, as you can see in that first shaded area, that roughly 68% of everything we produce is going to fall within one standard deviation on either side of our average. If we widen our view out to 2 standard deviations, that now contains about 95.5% of our output. And if we go all the way out to 3 standard deviations on each side, we capture a full 99.73% of everything our process makes. This 6 sigma spread, from -3 sigma all the way to +3 sigma, effectively defines the natural footprint of our process. It's the territory where our process naturally lives and operates. We call these the process's natural limits. All right, so we've listened carefully to the voice of the process. We understand its average, and we've measured its natural 6 sigma spread. But this knowledge just kind of exists in a vacuum. It's only half the story. Knowing our process's natural limits is pretty useless until we compare it to what the customer actually demands. So now we have to introduce that second voice, the voice of the customer. This is what defines what success really looks like. The voice of the customer is expressed through what we call specification limits. These are the absolute, non-negotiable boundaries of what's considered acceptable performance. The upper spec limit, or USL, is the highest value the customer will tolerate. The lower spec limit, or LSL, is the lowest. It is absolutely critical to understand that these limits have nothing to do with our process, its average, or its standard deviation. They are an external requirement, a demand that's placed upon us. Think of them as the goalposts on the field. Our process is the player, and our job is to figure out if our player can consistently kick the ball between those posts. And so the moment has finally arrived. We have our 2 voices, the voice of the process, our bell curve with its natural spread, and the voice of the customer, our goalposts, our specification limits. It's time to bring them together on the same chart. This is where we introduce the 2 most fundamental indices of process capability, Cp and Cpk. These metrics help us distinguish between what a process could theoretically do versus what it's actually delivering right this minute. To make this whole subject really intuitive and unforgettable, we're going to use a powerful analogy that we'll keep coming back to, the car and the garage. I want you to imagine that the width of the garage opening represents your specification width. That's the distance between your lower and upper spec limits. Now, imagine that the total width of your car represents your process spread, that 6 sigma range we just talked about. The entire question of process capability can now be framed very simply. Can you park this car in this garage without scraping the sides? Okay, our first index, Cp, measures potential capability. It answers the simplest possible version of our question. Is the car fundamentally smaller than the garage? That's it. Conceptually, the formula is just the garage width divided by the car width. Mathematically, that's our specification width, USL minus LSL, divided by our process width, 6 times sigma. Now, the crucial thing to understand about Cp is that it completely ignores where the car is parked. It only cares about the relative sizes. It makes this bold, optimistic assumption. For just a moment, let's pretend we could perfectly center our process. If we could, would it fit? And this illustrates perfectly the core difference between our 2 main indices. Cp asks this idealistic question about potential. If everything were perfectly lined up, could this process meet the requirements? Cpk, on the other hand, asks the realistic, practical question. Given where our process average is right now, is it actually meeting the requirements? It's not just about if the car fits. It's about whether the car is parked safely inside the garage, far away from either wall. So how does Cpk measure this real-world capability? Well, its logic is both simple and really profound. It recognizes that your true capability is only as good as your closest approach to failure, right? It doesn't matter if you have miles of room on one side of your car if you're scraping the paint on the other. So Cpk looks at 2 distances. First, it calculates the distance from your process average to the upper wall of the garage. That's the USL. Then it calculates the distance from your process average to the lower wall of the garage, the LSL. It measures both of these distances in units of 3 sigma. And then, and this is the key, it takes the minimum of those 2 values. Your Cpk is brutally honest. It's defined by your shortest distance to a garage wall. Let's make this totally concrete with our first numerical example. Imagine we're baking cookies. The customer says the weight has to be between 14 grams, our LSL, and 16 grams, our USL. we've collected some data and calculated that our process standard deviation, our sigma, is 0.24 grams. First, let's calculate Cp, our potential capability. The formula, remember, is garage width divided by car width. So what's our garage width? It's the USL minus the LSL. So 16 minus 14, which is 2 grams. That's the customer's total tolerance. What's our car width? That's our 6 sigma process spread. So 6 times 0.24 grams, which is 1.44 grams. Okay, so our car is 1.44 grams wide, and our garage is 2 grams wide. So Cp is 2 divided by 1.44, which gives us a result of 1.39. This tells us our process has the potential to be very capable. The car definitely fits in the garage. But now for the real test, calculating the actual capability, Cpk. Our cookie process has a potential Cp of 1.39, which is great. But after checking our data, we find our process average, our mean, is actually 15.2 grams. It's not perfectly centered at 15. It's shifted a bit towards the upper limit. This means we're parked closer to one garage wall than the other. So now we have to calculate the distance to both walls. Let's look at the upper side first. The distance from our mean, 15.2, to the USL, 16, is 0.8 grams. We divide that by our 3 sigma half width, which is 0.72. That gives us an upper capability of 1.11. Now for the lower side. The distance from our mean, 15.2, down to the LSL, 14, is 1.2 grams. We divide that by the same 3 sigma value of 0.72, which gives us a lower capability of 1.67. Cpk is the minimum of these two. It's that shortest distance to danger, so our Cpk is 1.11. You see how being off-center penalized our score? It dropped our real-world capability from a potential of 1.39 all the way down to an actual of 1.11. So, what do these numbers actually mean in the real world? Well, this table gives us some common benchmarks. A Cpk value less than 1.0 is a clear danger signal. It means your car is wider than the garage, or you're so off-center you're already hitting the wall. You are definitely making defects. A value of exactly 1.0 means the car is the exact same width as the garage, and you're perfectly centered. Any slight shift is going to cause problems. This is why many industries consider a value of 1.33 to be the minimum acceptable standard for a capable process. This gives you a safe buffer on both sides. And a value of 1.67 or higher, that's considered excellent or world-class. It represents a process with a really large safety margin, and it corresponds to what's known as a 6 sigma level of quality. Okay, we've now mastered the core concepts of Cp and Cpk. These are incredibly powerful tools, but they're based on a kind of snapshot view of our process. What happens over the long haul? Over weeks and months, with different shifts, different batches of raw material, gradual tool wear? To answer that, we need to add another layer of sophistication. We have to distinguish between short-term capability, which we've been talking about, and long-term real-world performance. And this brings us to a new parallel set of indices, Pp and Ppk. The entire difference between the C indices like Cpk and the P indices like Ppk comes down to one single thing: how we calculate the standard deviation. For Cp and Cpk, we use a short-term estimate of sigma. Think of this as a snapshot. It's calculated by taking small samples of data close together in time. We call these rational subgroups. This method is designed to only capture the inherent common cause variation of the process when it's running at its absolute best. It represents the process potential. For Pp and Ppk, however, we use the long-term overall standard deviation. This is the whole movie. We just throw all the data from a long period into one big bucket and calculate 1 sigma. This captures everything, all the short-term variation, plus any shifts, drifts, tool wear, and operator changes that happened over that time. It represents the actual historical performance of the process, warts and all. This quote from Jim Parnella just captures the distinction perfectly. Cpk is a forward-looking predictor. It tells you what your process can achieve if you manage to keep it perfectly stable. It's a measure of potential. Ppk, on the other hand, is a backward-looking report card. It tells you, historically, how the process has actually performed. You can't really use it to predict the future because it includes all the instability and special causes that have occurred. So let's just pull this all together with this summary table. We have 2 families of indices, each with 2 members. The capability family, Cp and Cpk, uses that short-term, snapshot variation to measure the process's potential. Cp looks only at the spread, while Cpk also considers the centering. The performance family, Pp and Ppk, uses that long-term, whole movie variation to measure actual historical performance. Pp looks only at the spread, while Ppk also considers centering. And here's the key insight. In a perfectly stable process, the short-term and long-term variation will be almost identical, which means your Cpk and Ppk values are going to be very close. A large gap between your Cpk and your Ppk is a clear mathematical signal that your process is unstable and has significant drifts or shifts happening over time. And this brings us to our final and maybe the most important topic of this whole masterclass. We've learned how to calculate these powerful indices that tell us so much about our process. But there is a critical, absolutely non-negotiable prerequisite that has to be met before any of these numbers, Cp, Cpk, Pp, or Ppk, have any real meaning at all. And that prerequisite is process stability. Without it, these calculations aren't just useless, they can be dangerously misleading. So let's be perfectly clear. Stability and capability are not the same thing. They're two different questions. A process is stable if it's in a state of statistical control. This just means its variation is predictable and consistent over time, coming only from common inherent causes. We use tools like control charts to verify this. Stability is the foundation. It is the prerequisite. Only once a process is proven to be stable can we meaningfully ask the second question, is it capable? A capable process is one that meets customer specifications. Its bell curve fits inside the goalposts. Capability is the goal. Trying to measure the capability of an unstable process is like trying to measure the width of a car while it's swerving wildly across 3 lanes of traffic. The number you get is meaningless because it's going to be different again in the next moment. You have to first stabilize the process. Get the car driving straight in 1 lane, and only then can you truly and reliably measure its capability. And that leaves you with a final critical question to take back to your own work. Are your processes stable enough to even begin this journey of understanding capability?